Hey, how's it going out there, gays? It is me again, Michael, Black Gay Comic Geek, and I am here. I have the pleasure of being able to talk to nationally and soon to be internationally known, award-winning, best-selling New York Times author, Terry J. Benton-Walker, author of Blood Debts, Blood Justice, Alex Wise versus the End of the World, Alex Wise versus the Cosmic Shift coming next month. We'll talk about that later. And the editor of The White Guy Dies First. And he also has a story in there too. So let's welcome Terry J. Benton-Walker. How are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. How are you? Thank you for having me.
I am well. Thanks for doing this interview because
Yeah,
I've been wanting to talk to you for a while because I'm a fan.
I
I'm a big
know.
I'm a
I
big
know.
fan.
I
So
appreciate that so much. Also, I want to say I'm not a New York Times best-selling author. I'm an indie bestseller.
okay,
Not,
well
I
it's
haven't
gonna
got I haven't got a New York Times yet.
it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen after this. We're gonna manifest it. That's why I had you got you
All
know
right.
when you speak something, it happens. So we're gonna speak it
Well,
into the
let's go
atmosphere.
ahead and speak it then.
There we go. So with that said, Terry, so how are you?
I am good. You know, um, I got a lot of really cool stuff in the pipeline too, and it's also been a really cool year with Blood Justice and The White Guy Dies First and Alex Wise versus the Cosmic Shift coming up. Um, it's a really, really cool time to be a citizen of the TJ verse.
Yes, and I can't wait to consume all of it. So with that said, you're a fan of superheroes, just like I'm a
Yes.
fan of superheroes. And one of the most important aspects of the superhero story is their origin, how they became superhero, whether it's Spider-Man getting bit by the radioactive spider, etc. But so with that said, I want to ask you, what is your origin story as an author? And how did you get into, fantasy and everything like that, superheroes, video games, all of that?
Ooh, very good question. So I had been into stories and fantasy since I was a young kid. And I didn't have an easy childhood growing up. So I often escaped into fantasy worlds via books, movies, video games. Like I've always been a gamer too. I had the very first Nintendo system, and I had the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis and the 64, all of that. Um, and as a kid, it took me a very long time to understand my sexuality and who I was as a person and how I fit in the world, especially when I'm dealing with bullshit from adults and from other kids and unhealed people. And we know what a plague they can be,
Uh-huh.
especially on young, developing queer folks, right? So, like, I escaped into stories, even though I had to do so by way of characters that did not look like me, that I didn't really relate to. I still had to find a way to have a good time, and I did. And I've always been a storyteller, and I've always been writing stories from the time that I was a kid up through adulthood. I had a poetry phase where I wrote poetry for a while. I don't anymore, but I actually still have all the poems that I wrote. And so I was going through, I think it was about 2009, I want to say. I was going through some like pretty heavy, like emotional stuff. And I sat down and just started free writing. And it turned into a chapter. And I was like, am I writing a book? Is that what's happening right now? So I posted it to Facebook to see it's like what people would say and if they thought I was any good or they were interested. And people were like, wow, this is really good. And so I was like, okay. And I went back and I wrote the second chapter and then I posted that again. And everyone that read the first chapter came back and read the second one, and more people came and read that. And they were like, the story is really good. I want to know what happens next.
And how old were you
And
when this
so
happened?
I was in my early 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly how old I was. This was back in 2008. So in 2008, I was, don't make me do math.
We'll just say early. We'll just stick with early 20s.
Yeah. I was in my early to mid twenties, but I finished writing that story, and I learned, I taught myself about publishing because I didn't have a publishing network at the time. So I was Googling and trying to figure out how you become a traditionally published author. And I learned about agents and querying. And I remember querying, I think about 170 agents for that book. And I got exactly 170 form rejections. And
Wow.
I remember a few of them were really upsetting. And I remember just crying. So I was like, man, this is hard. I don't know if I can do this. But I kept going. And I self-published. So that book turned into the first book of a trilogy. And I self-published that trilogy while I continued working on stories to be traditionally published. And self-publishing that series was cathartic for me because it allowed me the freedom to be able to tell the story the way that I wanted to tell it without having to deal with the pressures and the expectations of publishing gatekeepers. So I got to really explore my craft and like pushing boundaries and telling it's like the types of stories that traditional publishing would not let me tell. And so that was really fun. You can't get those books anymore.
That was going to be my next
So,
question. Can we
yeah,
find that story and what's the name of it?
no. A very different Terry wrote those books, so you can't find them anymore. They're gone. But while I was working on self-pubbing those books, I also started working on my first fantasy novel. And that was an experience too, because I still thought that even though I knew that there was a dearth of representation for Black queer people, I still felt like publishing didn't want to hear my story. So when I started working on my first fantasy novel, I wrote this story that had an all white, all straight cast. And I thought I was so smart because I was like, I'm about to Trojan horse these bitches. Hey, I'm gonna write this story with this straight white cast, and I'm gonna get in there, and I'm gonna sell that, and I'm gonna flip the script. And everything's gonna be Black and gay. Child, didn't nobody want that story? They saw right through me. But I was also learning a lot about craft and storytelling. So every time I would query and I would have to pull it, I would go back and I would pick up a craft book and I would read through it, teach myself something new, and then start working on it again. And I hired freelance editors and I worked with them and I learned a lot that way. And during that process, I met, actually, I read a book called Willful Machines by Tim Florine. And that was the very first time that I saw a queer male protagonist in a speculative story. And it blew me away. And I remember reaching out to Tim on Twitter and telling him how much I loved his story and how much it meant to me. And he was so nice. And we talked about, that story with the all straight, all white cast that would never ever see the light of day. And because it was always something about that just didn't feel right to me. Like I was invested in the story and I loved it, but it was just something was missing. And Tim advised me to always write my truth and don't try to hide myself and just be who I am. And he was like, write that story that you want to write. And he was like, make it Black and make it gay. And
That's my that's my motto. Make it Black or make it
right,
gayer.
that's why we get along so well, right? So that's something that's always stayed with me. And after talking to Tim, I felt the courage and the confidence to be able to trunk that story and work on something else. And it took me a few more manuscripts before I got to Blood Debts, which was originally called Queen. And that was actually a story that I queried for 2 rounds. And the second round, I did really well. I had like a 50% request rate from agents, but ultimately everybody passed because nobody had an editorial vision for it. And so I started working on my next book and I finished that one. It's a romantasy actually. And I queried my agent, my current agent, because in between Blood Debts and that book, she became an agent. She used to be an editor at Disney actually. And I queried her with that book. and she read it, loved it. We got on the call, and when she made me an offer, she asked me, did I have anything else in the pipeline? And I told her about Blood Debts, and I was like, I can't stop thinking about this book, and I would like for that to be the first book we work on together. And so she read it, and she came back, and she said she loved it, but she said that it would need a complete rewrite. But she had an editorial vision for it, and I was so dialed into what she was putting down, and we worked together over the next year to rewrite that book. And coincidentally, I signed with her at the end of 2019. So during the summer of 2020, I was working on rewriting Blood Debts. And so a lot of what was going on in the larger world with the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd really impacted how I told that story, because I was really struggling with injustice, both on a macro level in the world and also on a micro level in my life, because I was also dealing with injustice that I couldn't do anything about. Like I had gotten let go from a job simply because I was Black and gay, a job that was very lucrative, that I was doing very well at for no other reason other than, my sexuality and my race, two things that I cannot control. And it was very cathartic for me to put all of that raw emotion into this story. And I did that, and we went on submission with it. And after 2 weeks, we were at auction with several big publishing houses. And of course, it ended up at Tortini. And it's just been a dream working with them
And
ever
I can
since
see
then.
the whole pantheon of the TJ verse behind
Yeah,
you. But
see it all back
yep.
there.
And of course, we'll get into Blood Debts and everything, because I messaged you that I like just finished it, and I'm
Mhm.
like, I got to start Blood Justice soon. But one thing I do want to ask, like, you're hitting almost every question that I had in what you were saying. I'm like, dang, I'm not gonna know what to ask after this, because you're hitting every point. But
My bad. We
one
can
thing
just go deeper.
of course we're gonna go deep. I like it deep. But one thing that I do want to ask, like, especially like you mentioned earlier, like, because of everything that you were going through when you were younger, you went through a hard childhood and everything like that, and then just general injustice and everything, like, and then also diving into speculative fiction to get away from that and everything. I want to kind of ask, like, what was your coming out story like? How did that happen? And like, what was it that got you to that place to be able to finally just say, I'm here, I'm queer, this is who I am, and fuck you if you don't, vibe with it.
It actually took me a very long time to come to terms with my sexuality and my own queerness, right? So I always felt like I might have been queer, but I grew up like in a super conservative Christian household. So I was taught that that was wrong, right? And I actually remember, and I'm not exaggerating, I actually remember going into my closet as a preteen and just like getting on my knees and praying and crying and asking God to take it away. So I was like, if this is in me and it's so bad, then I don't want it. I want to be normal. And clearly, clearly that prayer didn't work. And actually, I'm glad it didn't, because I prefer how I am. You
Facts.
know,
I
like
can't I can't
you
I
know.
can't imagine being I don't want to be any other way.
hmm
Did you also grow up in a red state, or was it
I grew up in Georgia,
okay?
in southeastern Georgia, in a very small town. And so like that was also as a kid too, and this is why representation is so important. I didn't get to see any other Black gay men who weren't caricatures on television. So, it was like when we did see queer people, it was often we were made a joke of, right? So if I had had positive representation as a kid, it wouldn't have taken me so long to understand that it was okay to be who I was. And like I went to undergrad, so I left home and I went to Atlanta, and I went to undergrad at Georgia Tech. And I remember like living two lives. Like I would go hang out with my friends, 'cause all my friends were straight. And so I would go hang out with them, and then I would leave, like, "Oh, I got a headache, I gotta go." And then, like, I would go, like, go on a date with a guy or whatever, go see a guy. And, like, nobody, like, I felt like I had to hide that. And it wasn't until I was maybe like 21, 22 before, like, I actually said, you know what, this is who I am, fuck it. And, I haven't looked back. And I wish that it hadn't taken me so long, because it took me that long to just build up the courage to be able to say, this is who I am. Because when you figure out who you are and you figure out your self worth, you're going to have no shortage of people who are telling you every day to your face, that's not true and you're not shit. And you got to be strong enough to be able to stand in that and say, actually, that's not true. And, it's important. Like, this is an important question to me, because this is like the core of why I do what I do and why I tell the stories that I tell. And also why the Alex Wise series is one of the most special projects that I have right now. Because Alex Wise represents a younger version of myself. He represents 12-year-old me who didn't make it because he wasn't protected and he wasn't loved the way that he should have been, the way that he deserved. And so I wrote Alex's story, one, because he represents me, to
Since we're
give
talking
myself
about
a happy ending.
really quick, since we're talking about
Yeah.
Alex, show it off for the people.
Yes. Alex Wise versus the End of the World. This is book one.
Yes, get it at your local bookstores or go to bookshop.org.
Mm-hmm. And the sequel, Alex Wise versus the Cosmic Shift, is coming out September 24th. So that's why Alex Wise is really special to me, because he represents, that younger version of me. And the reason that I wrote that story is so that Black queer kids can see themselves represented and understand that they are deserving of love and that they can also be superheroes too. And a lot of Alex's story mirrors my own childhood, right? So Alex, at the opening of Alex Wise versus the End of the World, he thinks that, he might be gay, but it's something he hasn't been able to figure out for himself. But he's had all of these external influences impacting that, right? And hindering him from really getting to understand himself. Like, he felt like he wasn't good enough for his dad because he wasn't the all-American, like, athletic, straight boy. And, he was struggling with that relationship, and his dad, calling him an embarrassment because he couldn't play baseball, which is something that actually happened to me. Like, my dad signed me up for Little League when I was 9, and I didn't like baseball, but I did it just because I thought if I did it, I could impress him and I could make him love me. And instead, I overheard him telling somebody else that I was an embarrassment because I couldn't play and I wasn't athletic. He didn't try to help me learn. He just expected me to just automatically be good at it. And because I wasn't what he envisioned, then he threw me away, right? And so I pulled a lot of my own personal experiences out of my trauma archives and put it directly into Alex Wise to build his story. And I want other queer kids, especially Black gay boys, who are having similar experiences, to see themselves in Alex and to also understand that they can have a happy ending just like Alex did. And also, like, it took me 21 years, 21, 22 years to come out, and it took me 38 years to love myself, or to learn to love myself. I'm 40 now. So I do not want it to take another queer person, especially another Black queer person, especially another Black queer man, to love themselves. So that's why I write every single thing that I write.
Yeah, and this is something that, because with my platform as Black Gay Comic Geek, same thing you said, representation matters, and to take that a step further, through representation, it equals normalization. And I actually got this quote from a gospel song, a Karen Clark Sheard song that I take with me with everything that I do, is you got to see it before you see it, or you never will see it. And so kind of like what you were mentioning earlier about not seeing any black people or black queer people like you, especially in these fantasy speculative fiction stories, and deciding to write an all white family and everything
Mhm.
like that is because you didn't see yourself. And so
Yeah.
you didn't see yourself writing it. And so you kind of, it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy
Mhm.
in that sense. And so I know you kind of mentioned one story that you saw that where you know your first black queer character, but I kind of wanted to ask you in terms of like seeing, you know, you got to see it. Like, who were your other inspirations that inspired you to write? And then what story? What were other some of the stories you were reading while growing up? And like, what's some stories that you read today? Like, who are your inspirations today?
Mhm. Um, oh boy. That's a heavy question. So, growing up, I read some of everything. I don't really know that I had a favorite growing up. Like I was a booko. I would
Like, did you
go.
read Elon Harris? Is it like
I actually so baby, I'm old. Like Elia Harris wasn't out when I was that young. That was more like when I was like a little bit older. But I have read Elin Harris. His books are good. And I hate that we like that. I almost feel like that was almost all we had, right? It's like
pretty much?
every black gay man knows Elin Harris, and I'm like, it hurts that, and like even now, like there aren't that many black gay men writing speculative fiction,
Oh, that's
and
gonna be
that's
that was gonna be
why.
my next question.
Yeah, okay, so we'll get into it. We'll get into that. I won't I won't derail us. I promise I will answer your original question. So as a kid, so like we didn't have a lot of money growing up, and we were also from a rural country town. So we didn't have indie bookstores, we didn't have a Barnes and Noble, we didn't have a Walmart. So the only way I got access to books was through my school's library and the public library. And so I would have very fond memories of my mom over the summers. My mom would take me to the library like almost every other day, definitely at least once a week. It just depending on how fast I zip through the books that we get. And so I would spend so much time there just like scouring the shelves and pulling down all these books. And I've read all kinds of stuff. Um, and I liked stories like The Boxcar Children. I liked, there's a series called Miss Piggle Wiggle's Magic that I liked, and Amelia Bedelia. And again, but these are all stories about white folks, but it was read that or nothing, right? So, and then as I got older and I started reading more fantasy, I loved The Golden Compass, his Dark Materials series by Philip Pullman. That was one of my first fantasy series that I got into. I read that one multiple times, and The Hobbit. So I read The Hobbit. I tried to read The Lord of the Rings, but that was a little too complex for me. I didn't know what was going on. So I want to try again later, but my TBR is so bad right now. I don't know when I'm gonna have
I'm
time
like,
to.
just watch the movie.
Yeah, right. I watched the movie. I like the movies. So when I started writing fantasy, I was a huge Harry Potter fan, and I'm gonna tell you a story. So
That's what this interview's for.
yeah, right. I was a huge Harry Potter fan, so I refused to when everybody was super into it. Like I refused to read it, and I had a friend that loved it so much, and we worked close together. And so, like, we would meet often for lunch. And one day we met, and she brought the first book, and she said, "I want you to read it." And I said, "Okay." So I read it, and I just immediately fell in love with it. And I like zoomed through the rest of the books. I got all the books on audio. I had multiple versions of the hardcovers, the paperbacks. Anytime the cover art was redone, I would get the paperbacks and like they're still in the box set and sealed with plastic on them. I like had all the movies and like I went and I downloaded all of the documentaries about this lady and her journey to publishing because like I really identified with her story of how she came up, with the idea, and just like how she became an author and how she was so successful. And when I was querying and I was getting rejections and I was getting down, I would get down on myself. I would go watch those documentaries and it would like pump me back up. And I remember when she went full on mask off and started terrorizing the trans community and the queer community. And I remember being like, what the fuck? Like, where did this come from?
I think we all felt that.
And I like remember people like uncovering stuff that she put into the series that I had no idea was there, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. And like I never agreed with it. I didn't agree with anything that she did, especially like the transphobia. But the one thing that really hurt me was when I discovered that she had said that the werewolves in the story was a metaphor for queer men with AIDS. And there's a particular plot thread in that series where one of the werewolves like has a proclivity for like attacking children and like eating children and turning them into werewolves and stuff. And I was just like, that's so sinister. I can't even like like you've been crossed the line, but like that is like go to the ninth circle of hell. I can't believe you actually wrote that and you were dead ass serious. So, as much as that series meant to me before I found out the truth, and as deep as I was in it, the moment I found out what went into it, I immediately was like, no more. Don't support it. Don't watch it. Don't read the books. Don't want them. Don't want to talk about it. Don't want to be around it. And I have not regretted it, and I've never looked back. And that's why you can't separate the art from the artist, because as an artist myself, I put my own experiences and my own beliefs into my work. And me personally, I do not ever want my identity to be separate from my art because my identity is political. And as long as my identity remains political, I'm going to continue to write about my identity. And that is something that I take very seriously because I am writing for a demographic that needs to see themselves represented and needs to see themselves represented in a positive light. And I like that moment, I realized that as much as I looked up to her in the past, now that I know who she really is, like I just couldn't vibe with it. And besides, like there's so much, like, I mean, look at what's back here. And there's so many other black talented black people writing fantasy stories and
That
writing
don't get
speculative
the
stuff
same
that,
opportunities.
yeah, that like we don't need to. She got enough money. She clearly don't know what to do with it. Because let me tell you something. I had that much money, I would just disappear in my castle. Like, why is
Yeah,
you
she
out here
made her
starting
mind. All she
shit?
had to do was just be quiet, not say nothing, and she could have
All you
just
had to do was relax.
she could have still had those beliefs in her head, but she didn't have to say nothing. She just could have coasted
Mm-hmm.
on the love and adoration that people had for her, and now it's just she tainted the world.
Mm-hmm.
But not even just your identity, your blackness, your queerness being political, but even outside of that,
Mm-hmm.
our identity is more than just like us being gay. Because I see this all the time. Like even with my name being Black Gay Comic Geek, I don't care about who you sleep with. Why you need to advertise that as your username? It's like
Mm-hmm.
me being gay is more than just about who I sleep with. It determines who I even want to talk to or who I don't feel comfortable talking to, the spaces I feel comfortable or not comfortable entering, the policy decisions I feel comfortable or not comfortable supporting. I might watch a show because, oh, they have a gay character, or I might not be interested in a show because they don't have a black
Mm-hmm.
character. Just like how me being black determines how I walk through the world, the spaces I won't go to, the sundown towns. You won't catch me there because of my blackness. So it's more than just about
Mm-hmm.
who I'm sleeping with. It determines everything about my personality. So when people say, "Oh, I don't mind this character being gay," so long as it's not their whole personality. Being gay is my whole fucking personality. So with that said, to get into my next question in terms of like challenges, and there not really being that much, especially when it comes to speculative fiction, or at least I want to ask your opinion on it. Do you think, because like I feel like for me, like when I'm looking for, because I love fantasy, I always say the things I love to talk about or the things I love to read, watch has blood, sex, gore, and magic. And so a lot of times when I look for that type of material, I do find a lot of black sapphic work,
Mhm.
but it's a struggle to find like fantasy written by or about a black queer male. And I want to know, do you kind of feel that that's true? And why do you feel like that is? Is it a publishing thing? Do you think publishers are more willing to accept like the sapphic characters? Because even with there being lesbian, it still applies to the male gaze, and straight men could still like
Mhm.
romanticize lesbian characters, or like why do you think that is? I don't know.
I
Or do you think that's the case?
no, I absolutely think that's the case. And this is something that I've actually thought about, and it's something that I'm trying to impact myself. I'm only one person, right? But I have four mentees right now. I'm about to have five, so I'm about to bring somebody else in. But not all of them are black gay men. But that's something that I'm always thinking about, because it can't just be like me and a couple of other folks out here. Like we can't carry this load by ourselves. We need more voices. And I'm trying to do as much as I can to help bring more people in after me. And I think that the reason that we don't have more of us writing speculative stories is because I think it's multifaceted, right? It's layered, right? So one thing I think is that we have kind of been run out of the market because there have not been stories for us. So we stopped looking. And so if we stop looking and we stop reading, then that's where writers come from. So if nobody's being inspired by stories to write, then our pipeline of upcoming authors dries up, right? And then the authors who are inspired and are trying, it takes us so long because a lot of us don't have community. And that lack of community leads to a lack of resources and a lack of information, which makes it even more difficult to get into publishing, because even if the playing field was level from like that aspect, right? It's still very hard to get into because it's so subjective. Like one agent could say your story is trash and another agent could love it. One editor could say the same thing and another could love it. And you could write the best book ever, like known to man, and you could put it out and it could flop, right? So, like with all of that, it's already very hard. But then we got to also deal with systemic racism and bigotry and biases and all of this other stuff, and the fact that we have to be twice as good to get half as much to even get our foot in the door. And that is part of what took me 8 years and seven manuscripts to sign with my agent. And it took me so long because during that whole time, I was learning and I was building community, because I started from ground zero. I had no knowledge. I knew nobody. Like there was nobody I could turn to get help or to get information. And I just had to figure it out on my own. And every time I would put something together and I would have to shelve it, I would take a beat, I would learn some more craft, and then I would go back and I would try again. And so after I signed with my agent and we started working on Blood Debts, I put together a novel planning kit. And that is actually a collection of all of the exercises that I've cherry picked from all of that craft work that I did over the past 8 years and seven manuscripts. And I created these worksheets and put this novel planning kit together. And it's available for free download on my website. And the reason I did that is to create a
And
resource.
drop the website for the people.
Yeah, so the website is tjbentonwalker.com. And there's a section called Writing Resources. And the novel planning kit is saved there. And it's a collection of worksheets that I put together from all of that craft study that I did over 8 years and 7 manuscripts. And these are the same exercises that I use for building my own stories. And it'll help you build a story from concept to a high level outline to get you started. And there's even a worksheet in there on like putting together a query pitch for when you're ready to query agents. And I put that together. It'll always be a free resource. I update it as I learn new things and I implement new methods. And I intended for it to be a resource to help marginalized authors, especially Black gay authors. So if you're out there and you're watching this and you want to write and you don't know where to start, go to my website, download that. It's free and it'll help you get started.
And speaking of like the idea, which we all know the iconic scene from Scandal with Eli Pope
Mm-hmm.
having to work twice as hard to get half as far. And then even when you get that moment when you become a published author, you still got to worry about the world and how
Mm-hmm.
the world is going to affect your work, especially in this era of Trumpism. And we're going through this whole entire era right now of especially LGBTQ books being banned, or books that are dealing with critical race theory or Black history and everything like that. And so actually, let me pull out this because I kind of want to read it verbatim. So according to the American Library Association, LGBTQ content drove book banning efforts in 2023. And in 2023, the American Library Association recorded 4,240 unique titles that have been targeted for removal or restriction in libraries and schools. It's a record-breaking 65% increase from 2022. And so I want to ask you, as an openly gay author yourself, like, what are your thoughts on LGBTQ books being banned? How do you think we could combat that? And did you yourself run into any of those issues with your books
Mm-hmm.
being banned? And how do you navigate through that?
Mm-hmm. So I have actually been lucky. All of my books have flown under the radar for ban, so I have not been banned yet. I do like this whole situation with the banning is bullshit, right? It makes me very angry. And the reason being is because the book bans are directly in conflict with the core of who I am and the core of why I do what I do. And I learned that knowledge is power, and having knowledge and wisdom leads to having peace, right? And a lot of queer people, queer artists, are creating art that teaches our kids to love themselves, to advocate for themselves, and to be themselves. And I think that the bigots and the racists and all the other is, I think that they don't like that because they don't want us to see ourselves and to have that knowledge and to have that power to be able to stand up for ourselves, because if we do, then we won't be easy to exploit, we won't be easy to abuse, we won't be easy to manipulate, and just like I hear stories all the time about like little kids who were being like sexually abused by someone, an adult close to them, and they only found the language to be able to communicate that to their parents from reading a book about it. And the book banners want to take that away. And it's not because they think that that material is bad or pornographic. It's because they don't want the kids to have that knowledge, because they don't want the kids to be able to call for help and to be able to understand and discern when something's not right. And as a queer artist, that's what I put into my story. Like I write these stories for queer kids to see themselves and to see different scenarios and understand like what's going on and how to move through certain things and how like what can happen if, like you don't pay attention and you don't speak up for yourself, right? And like I take it as a personal attack on my community because kids are really like, especially kids are very special, right? Especially black kids, especially black queer kids, and um, they should be protected. And like I write what I write and I create the art that I do to teach them and to mold them and to nurture them and protect them. And the fact that somebody is attacking that and wants to take away those protections makes me very angry. Um, but I will say, I'll leave you on a little bit of hope. One of my publishers, Penguin Random House, has been partnering. I think they've been partnering with Pen America, but they have been doing a lot with fighting against book bans nationwide. And it has been really good as a PRH author to get the updates from my publisher and just know that they're standing behind their authors and they're actually trying to do something to make it better.
Yeah, a lot of times people are quick to try to talk about the gay agenda. Oh, if there's a gay character in here, oh, it's a gay agenda. They're trying to push it on children. And it's like, no, we just want to let people know, regardless of your age range,
Mm-hmm.
that we're here and we just want to live our life, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Nobody talks about the straight agenda. The straight
Mm-hmm.
agenda is always about,
Right.
not allowing us to be able to live our full, authentic truth. That's the real
Mm-hmm.
agenda that's insidious that needs to be talked about
Mm-hmm.
more. And so
And
also, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say when somebody says to me the gay agenda, like having this character and here's the gay agenda, you damn right it is. My agenda is for gay people and gay kids, black gay kids, to see themselves represented, so they know not to deal with your bullshit. So yeah,
Exactly.
that's my agenda.
Exactly. And speaking of bullshit, let me ask you this. In addition to like the book banning thing, I don't know if you were like actively online during this time, but also during like 2020, because you mentioned like the George Floyd era and everything like that, and
Mm-hmm.
what kind of inspired you to write Blood Debts. But also during that time, there was a hashtag that was going on that was started by L. McKinney called Publishing Paid Me, where
Mm-hmm.
she started it and a bunch of other black authors jumped on it, where it was talking about the discrepancy of like either how they got published or what they were paid versus like what white authors and publishers were paid for either almost the same type of work or not even the same resume as their black
Mm-hmm.
authors, and highlighting the racist disparity between that. And I wanted to know your thoughts. Were you around? Were you around when you noticed that hashtag? Your thoughts on that? Have you experienced anything like that? And then how do you move past that? And then what advice
Mm-hmm.
would you give for any other black authors trying to get out there and then still having to deal with this mostly white publishing space? And have
Mm-hmm.
you experienced any like pushback with regards to your books, especially being black and queer?
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the first part of your question, with publishing paid me, I do remember when that was going on. I thought it was great to shine light on, some of the issues and disparities, specifically when it comes to how we're getting paid and how much we're getting paid and all of the details around that, right? And that's part of the reason why community is so important. And that became a resource for us to be able to better advocate for ourselves. I have not, well, I don't want to say I haven't dealt with it because I have dealt with, like shenanigans and people trying not to pay me. Not my current publishers, but like when we were going on the submission, there were shenanigans. There's always shenanigans. However, what I will say is my agent is a black queer woman,
Okay.
and she don't play. Okay, so she she wants to smoke all the time. So when you work with her and you're talking about me, you got to come correct. And one thing that I appreciate about her too is when we were in a situation where I had gotten an offer for blood beds actually that was a good offer, but I didn't feel comfortable with it. And I didn't know how to explain that to her. because I didn't want to sound ungrateful, right? And so that's part of our queer trauma. It's because we spend our whole lives like shrinking ourselves so we take up as little space as possible because we don't want to upset people and we don't want to be a burden and we want everybody to just know that we're, like we're not a burden and it's okay and like just leave us alone and let us be gay and we'll be all right, right? So it was hard for me to like exist in that moment and speak up for myself, but she listened. Not only did she listen, like she validated me and how I was feeling, and she went and she actually did something about it. And she handled it. She introduced me to more editors, and that was how I met the editor that I ended up selling the Blood Debt series to, and who came back and bought The White Guy Dies First, and it's Ali Fisher at 14. And I had similar experience too when we went out with Alex Wise, but I ended up getting with a publisher, Lisa Abrams at Labyrinth Row, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And I had just been so fortunate that I have publishers that one pay me my worth, and they both treat me incredibly well, and they are so super supportive of me and my art and the stories that I'm telling and the reason that I'm telling the stories. I've actually had, believe it or not, I have had no issues with, you know, with my stories or my storytelling. They have both been incredible partners and have pushed me to constantly level up and, if anything, be more authentic and tell more of my story. And for the longest, I can't wait for you to read Blood Justice. Because for the longest, after I finished that book and it went to production, I would just sit here like, I can't believe they let me publish this book. Because Blood Justice, like if you thought Blood Debts was wild and black, Blood Justice is off, just like off the charts, and it is black, black, blackity black. I cannot wait for you to read it because it's a wild ride. Like, is the last 100 pages is gonna fuck you up. So when you get, so the story is told in
Okay.
five parts. When you get to part 4, buckle up, secure your edges.
My
Clear your
beard at this,
schedule.
because up
Yeah.
here, up here is gone.
Hold on to what's left. Because those last 100 pages are going to drag you. It's so wild.
Okay. So speaking of that, because we talked earlier about Alex Wise versus the End of the World, and then Alex Wise versus the Cosmic Shift coming in September. So
Yes.
check it out. And then Blood Debts. And then those two are more like kid friendly, kind of like Percy Jackson. And then you have Blood Debts and Blood
Hmm.
Justice, which is more young adults.
Hmm.
And then also you have The White Guy Dies First,
Yes.
and your contribution to that. You wrote that haunted house story, and I got real like New York. I said haunted house, haunted, but told from the perspective of the house, and
Hmm.
that's more horror based. I kind of wanted to ask, since you kind of dipped your toe into all these different genres, do you have a favorite that you like to write in? And then
Hmm.
also, what's a genre or a story that you haven't told that you would like to eventually dip your toe in?
So, my so it's my favorite. Like goes back and forth. Sometimes it's fantasy. Sometimes it's horror. Um, I will always write both. I don't see myself ever like turning my back on either one. And something that a genre that I'm actually getting more into is romance, believe it or not. Um, my next book with my tour contract is an adult romantasy, and it is a science fiction and fantasy mashup inspired by The Last Unicorn. And of
And
course, like
what's
every,
the last unicorn?
you don't know about The Last
I don't know
Unicorn?
about the last unicorn.
Oh my God. Okay, so listen. So
So for
this,
all the people out there in the world that's like me,
so it's okay. It's okay. I'm gonna put you on the game. So there was this really trippy movie in the 80s. It was an animated film, and I watched it as a kid. And I probably shouldn't have been watching it as a kid, but it's based on a book by Peter S. Beagle called The Last Unicorn. And I think the book might have been published in the 60s. And don't quote me on that. But they made an animated film in the 80s, and a bunch of like celebrities were in it. Like Mia Farrow played the unicorn, and somebody, Jeff Bridges, I believe, was in it too. Um, but it's about this. It's like second world fantasy, and it's about this unicorn. And like in this world, unicorns are like goddesses, right? So they're just like immortal, like mythological creatures. And so this unicorn lives in this enchanted forest. And one day, a talking butterfly comes to her and tells her that she's the last unicorn in the world. And she doesn't believe him. And he like, nah, sis, like, I'm for real. So she's like, I'm finna go see for myself. So she leaves the enchanted forest and goes to find the other unicorns. And so along the way, she meets a wizard and she meets a maid named Molly, and I think that's where the term Molly the maid comes from. Also, again, don't quote me on that, but I just thought it was very interesting that she was called Molly and she was a maid. This came out in the 80s, so I don't know. But either way, so there's actually this other mythological creature called the Red Bull that is hunting down all of the unicorns and driving them into the sea. And so after she meets the wizard and the maid, the Red Bull comes and the wizard turns her human. And then they go to the castle to meet King Haggard and his son. And so it's like a love story about like her being human and falling in love with the prince, and they're trying to figure out the secret of the Red Bull and like how to free the unicorns. And it's so good. So I am going to write a version of that story, my own story that pays homage to the Last Unicorn. And there's dragons, and of course it's black and gay. So I can't tell too much about it because it's not
Okay.
announced yet, but
Yeah.
it's coming out in 2026.
All right.
And yeah, so there's a really intense like romance story in there. So that I'm like dipping my toe into romance a little bit more. And then after I finish that, I'm also working on an adult psychological horror. And I'm touching on like romantic relationships in that one too, but the opposite. So I want to show like toxic, abusive relationships.
I mean, I feel like you kind of did that with that house, that haunted house. I'm like, oh, this man is
Yeah,
toxic. This house is toxic.
no, well, so actually, so let's get into that, right? So that story is an allegory about domestic abuse
Which actually
survivors.
give for the people this is his story that he wrote in The White God Dies First. Give a brief
Okay,
synopsis.
yeah, okay, so I wrote
And
so
we're also
my
running up
story.
on time, so we got to be brief because
Okay,
I have two more questions I want to ask you. So
okay. So my story is called The Road to Hell, and it's a haunted house story, and it is told in second person perspective, from the POV of a haunted house that was created in the 1600s in a haunted swamp in the Florida Everglades. And it's narrating to a 16-year-old boy named Danger who moves in one summer with his two dads to rehab the property. And the house becomes enamored with the boy and his family and wants to pull out all the stops to get them to make it their forever home, despite it being terribly haunted. And things just go off the rails, and the house ends up
no spoilers.
unleashing a
No
night of
spoilers.
unbridled terror on the family. No, I'm not gonna spoil it. Um, that would ultimately teach the house why the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so this story is an allegory about domestic abuse survivors and how sometimes our trauma can manifest in our pursuit of love. So yeah, the house is toxic, but it's a product of its environment and the trauma that like was inflicted on it. It was
Yeah, it was
trying its
inflicted
best.
on it. Yeah. So definitely check out that story. So with that said, since like I said, I have two more questions I wanted to ask. Or one is a question, then the other was a statement. So also
Mhm,
going back to like stories that you or genres that you maybe want to dip your toe in, because I know you're a big superhero fan. Like you inject a lot
mhm,
of that in like you talk about it even in the Road to Hell was talking about his
hmm
D&D campaign. Alex
hmm
Wise is a huge nerd, and you mentioned
Yep.
Marvel and everything like that. Would you ever want to write a superhero novel? And also on the flip side of that, have you ever thought about trying to write like maybe like a one-off short story for like a Marvel or DC, or even just your own
hmm
independent comic book?
hmm So I would actually love to like come up with my own original superhero. So Alex Wise kind of is like the whole Alex Wise trilogy is a superhero origin story. So every book like shows his journey to becoming a superhero, but it's more like an internal journey than an external journey. Like he still gets like all of the cool external powers and like he's fighting monsters and doing cool stuff, but the core of it is his internal journey, right? So like in book one, he has to learn to accept and love himself to be able to tap into his true power. And so in book two, he's building upon that and learning, like he's learned how to love himself, but he has to hold on to that while also navigating the complex relationships with everybody around him and also dealing with failure. And then in book three, he has to put all of that to use while he's actually going up against his biggest abuser and also having to save the world, right? And so I would love to continue. So the way that I end the series, I leave it open ended so it could we could carry it forward and almost kind of like how Rick Riordan did with the Heroes of Olympus. And it would be more of like a superhero, like Avengers type situation going forward if I got to expand the series. And I would love to write IP for Marvel or DC. My only caveat is that it has to be black and gay.
Of
So as
course.
long as I can do that.
All right, so final. Well, this isn't a question. I keep wanting to say final question, but final statement rather. So this is your time to shine, even though this whole interview was your time to shine. But we're also here to sell. We're here to promote. So I want you to go through because you got them all behind you, each and every single one of your books, and in a brief, maybe 2 or 3 sentences, tell us give us a synopsis of the books, what they're about, and then why you should pick them and buy them. Why you should pick them up.
Cool. So we'll start with Alex Wise series, Alex Wise versus the End of the World, and Alex Wise versus the Cosmic Shift. So this is a middle grade contemporary fantasy series. It features an all black, all queer cast. And Alex Wise is 12 years old, and the story picks up the summer after his sixth grade year in school when he ends up going on vacation with his little sister and his estranged dad and his new family. Him and his sister accidentally unleash the four horsemen of the apocalypse, who are gods from a parallel universe who have escaped into Earth and want to take over Earth and colonize the planet and set up their home base here so they can colonize the rest of the multiverse. So death possesses Alex's 10-year-old little sister and kicks off a global apocalypse. And Alex is also chosen by an ancient god and given special superpowers. But to tap into his true power, he has to learn to love and accept himself. And the sequel is Alex Wise versus Cosmic Shift, and it continues the story exactly where we left off at the end of Alex Wise versus the End of the World. So my next series is the Blood Debts series. So the first book is Blood Debts. This is the paperback cover. And this is the hardcover. So if you see this in stores or online, it's the same series. We just did a cover refresh for the paperback and for the sequel, Blood Justice. So I like to pitch this series as a contemporary Game of Thrones featuring black and black queer teens set in a modern day New Orleans. So 30 years after the most brutal magical massacre in New Orleans history, twin heirs of a dethroned family set out to right the wrongs in their family's past and bring about the justice that they are owed. So if you like a lot of the political maneuvering and expansive story worlds and a huge cast of Game of Thrones, with like the down south, like black feeling of just like being in New Orleans and being like immersed in the culture and the community. Also with complex family dynamics and drama and lots of magic.
Yeah, as I was reading, I was like,
Yeah.
it's giving Eve's Bayou vibes.
hmm Yeah, like the if you like the originals, the television show, but you wish it were blacker and gayer. this is it for you. And
Don't get me
then Blood
started on the
Justice,
Vampire Diaries. Hashtag justice for Bonnie Bennett.
right? So if you wanted justice for Bonnie Bennett, read this series. And I'm really proud of Blood Justice. This is the sequel to Blood Debts. And this whole series is a protest. It's a form of activism for me. You know, we talked about why I wrote this series and why it's so important, but Blood Justice goes in. It's like Blood Debts on steroids. That's all I'm saying about that. So get both. If you're new to the series, go ahead and get both. Because when you finish this, you're gonna want to jump into this immediately.
Agreed.
And then the last is The White Guy Dies First. So this is a young adult horror anthology. It just came out on July 16th. So I edited this anthology, and I also contributed a story to it. And this is really cool because this is a collection of scary stories from 13 incredible BIPOC authors, myself included, where we reclaim our roles in classic horror subgenres, and the white guy always dies first. So what's cool about this project is I created a list of 20 classic subgenres of horror. And so it's stuff like haunted house, cannibals, slasher, nature's revenge, killer clowns. And I sent the list out to the contributors, and everyone got to pick a subgenre for their story that they had to subvert in a new and exciting way. And of course, the white guy has to always die first. And I will tell you, I'm a horror fan. If you are a horror fan, then you got to have this, because this is an elevated horror experience. Like, I didn't just edit this anthology, like, I curated this collection. So the authors that have been chosen to be in this anthology were all like especially picked by me and my editorial team. And when we did the editorial process, like, we worked on this book for like a year and a half, just like taking our time and making sure that we dived into each story and found the core and the heart of each one, and really helping them shine. So this is quintessential must-have for horror enthusiasts.
All right, so there you have it. Get the TJ verse. You saw it, you heard it here. So we're pretty much at time, but actually, because as you were talking, I'm like, I want to ask this one last question. So
Okay.
try to be brief. But I'm kind of curious with the white guy dies first, and I know you kind of talked about it a little bit briefly in like the intro story, but did you get any pushback with the title? Like, I don't know if I wanted to, like, people like, oh, this is racist, or what if I said the black guy dies first, or anything like that? Like, did you experience any of that, or no?
No, like, definitely not from my publisher. Like, when I told them the title, they screamed. They were like, yes, like, do it now. And believe it or not, I haven't gotten any public backlash. Like, I might have only gotten like one random comment from some random like white dude who was like, find something else to do, and I was like, go away. But like, for the most part, everybody's been super receptive.
Okay, that's good. That's good. I was just curious about that. So with that said, Terry, thank you so much for
Thank you. This
your
was fun.
time. I still got way more questions to ask, but he told me no more than an hour. So, so we gonna cut it. So with that said, guys, again, it's your website. If you're an author, go to tjbentonwalker.com and get that outline and that that resource for you. And thank you, gays, for joining us. With that, the motto: make it blacker, make it gayer, and go get TJ's books. And with that, thanks for joining. We are out.